Welcome to Veritate with your host, Johnny Mack, a podcast that will dive deep into the pursuit of truth in a world filled with noise, confusion, and fleeting opinions. We will seek to uncover the eternal, unshakable truths that shape our lives and our beliefs, from faith and philosophy to history and culture. We'll explore the questions that matter, challenge the answers we've been given, and seek the wisdom that has stood the test of time. So join Johnny Mack in this journey to discover what's real, what's right, and what's true.
Welcome again to Veritate, and I'm your host, Johnny Mack. We've covered a lot of ground in this series, from Martin Luther, John Calvin, the Anabaptists, the Baptists, the Great Schism, Anglicanism, Methodism, Presbyterianism, Pentecostalism, and today we are going to dive into the Episcopal Church. Now, every one of these traditions call themselves Christian, and every one of them will use that word without hesitation. And so does your Methodist aunt, and so does your Baptist co-worker, and your neighbor at the non-denominational church with that big screens and the music. One word. And it's assumed to mean roughly the same thing to everyone in the room. But here's the thing. It does not. So, do you remember algebra? And do you remember how your teacher just didn't want the answer? Your teacher wanted you to show the work, because the work was where the truth lives. And you can arrive at a confident, neatly written wrong answer, because without the work visible, you cannot tell the difference. And so if your starting premise is wrong, no amount of careful reasoning fixes it, because the error doesn't stay contained. It moves through every line that follows. And the further you go, the further you get from the right answer. And that is what this series has been about. And that's what we've been doing the whole time. We're not just asking what each tradition believes, but we're asking, how did they get there? And we're showing the work. And I want to add something to that framework. And it's something that doesn't come from algebra. It comes from the mouth of Jesus himself. So in Matthew 16, Jesus asked his disciples a direct question. He said, "Who do people say the Son of Man is?" Now they give him the popular answers. Some say he's John the Baptist, some say Elijah, some say Jeremiah. But he continues to press him, and he says, "Who do you say that I am?" Now Simon Peter, he answers, and he says, "You are the Messiah. You are the Son of the living God." And Jesus then responds with words that every person we have discussed in this series should have considered before they built anything. Jesus says, "Upon this rock, I will build my church." He doesn't say churches. He doesn't say a variety of expressions. He doesn't say a spectrum of traditions under a shared umbrella. He says, my church. That is singular. That is possessive. That means it is his. He didn't say you will build it. He didn't say a council will build it. He didn't say the General Convention will vote on it. He did not say the reformers will recover it. He said, I will build it. So the architect has been identified. Now, remember, even when he appears to Paul, and Paul was on the road to Damascus, and he was going to Damascus to do what? He was going to Damascus to kill Christians. But what did Jesus say to him? He said, "Saul, Saul, why do you persecute me?" Not my church. The owner of the church has been identified. And there is only one church, just as there is only one Christ. In John chapter 10, he says it again. He says that I have other sheep that are not of this fold. I must bring them also. They will listen to my voice. And there will be one flock and one shepherd. You hear that? One flock, one shepherd. Not a coalition, not a fellowship of like-minded congregations, one. In John chapter 17, on the night before he dies, Jesus prays. And he didn't pray for power. And he didn't even pray for survival. He prayed for unity. He says that they all may be one, as you, Father, are in me and I in you. He is praying for the same unity that exists within the Trinity itself. Now, that's not a metaphor for friendly cooperation between denominations. That is a standard that is so high that it can only come from God. And he prayed it as a request to the Father. It means he treated it as something real, something that could exist, something that should exist. And remember, God is a creator. If he says it, in the beginning was the Word, his words create something. Now, I want you to look at what we have built. According to the Center of Study of Global Christianity at Gordon Conwell Theological Seminary, there are now today 50,000 distinct Christian denominations worldwide. And if we go back to 1900, there were roughly 2,000. So in 1 century, the number grew 25-fold. Each one of them were convinced that it was correctly reading the same book, and each one of them were certain enough in their conclusions to separate themselves from the others, and each one of them calling themselves Christians. So the question is that one flock? Is that the answer to his prayer? Now, I want to look at what America specifically added to that number, because the United States tax code uses the word church, and I'm using a little c here. But the IRS, the Internal Revenue Service, applies no theological test to that word. There's no creed required, there's no accountability structure, there's no connection to any historical tradition. According to the IRS itself, a church is automatically tax exempt simply by virtue of existing. You don't even need to file paperwork, which means anyone with a Bible and a building and a message can call themselves a church. And of course, tens of thousands of people have done that. This Reformation principle of private interpretation, when it's carried to its legal conclusion, it is now embedded in the tax code of the United States. Every man is his own theologian, every congregation is its own authority, and the government has made it official. Now, here's where America enters the deeper story. And I want to be precise because this really matters. America was built on freedom. And that is a fact. It's self-determination, individual conscience, the right to govern yourself. And these values are written into the founding documents and even into the American soul. Notice I can go anywhere in the world. I can speak Spanish and I could move to Mexico. I cannot become Mexican. I can be an American who moves to Mexico, but I won't be Mexican. I can go anywhere in the world. I cannot become one of them. But anyone in the world can come to America and become American. Why? Because we believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. We don't define life, we don't define liberty, and we don't define the pursuit of happiness. And so these are genuinely good values in their proper domain. But somewhere along the way, these values, they migrate into the church, and they truly don't belong there. Not in the way that they were applied, because the Christian understanding of freedom is not self-determination. The Christian understanding of freedom is surrender. Jesus himself is the model of that. Look in the Garden of Gethsemane. When he's facing the cross, he prays the most important prayer in human history. He says, "Father, if it is possible, let this cup pass from me." And that is human will. And that is honestly expressed because he doesn't pretend that it's not there. But when he finishes that prayer, he says, "Not my will, but yours be done." Not my will, but yours. That is Christian freedom. It's the freedom to lay down what you want and take up what God requires. That's the freedom that looks from the outside, like the opposite of freedom. Now let's look at what the American religious experiment has produced. Every man is his own theologian. Every congregation is its own authority. Every denomination is the product of someone deciding that his reading of Scripture was correct and that the previous structure was wrong. That is not surrendered will. That is self-determination dressed up in theological language. That is American freedom applied to a domain where it was never meant to govern. God gives us free will, and this is a true and it is a serious gift. God will not force you to love him. He will not compel your obedience. He has built the capacity for genuine choice into human nature. Because quite honestly, love that's not chosen is not love. Remember, I've said this many times. Love is not love. I don't care what the current generation says. Love is sacrifice. But the gift of free will is not an invitation to construct your own theology. It's not permission to decide which part of the church's teaching you accept. It's not a mandate to split from every structure you disagree with and then call that split a reformation. The gift of free will is the capacity to say yes to God. It's the highest use of surrender. It's not self-expression, it's surrender. And so when we trace the denominational story from Martin Luther forward, what we're actually watching is free will increasingly applied to theology. Because every split is someone deciding. And then that deciding moves further and further from the one flock and the one shepherd that Jesus had described. Now, I want to be charitable, and I mean that genuinely, because charity doesn't mean pretending that the differences don't matter. Real charity is what a doctor gives you when he reads the chart and tells you the truth. And you can deliver the truth without contempt. But you cannot deliver it while pretending that the diagnosis is fine. And here's the final piece of this frame before we move forward. If the premise is wrong, you cannot reform your way back to the right answer. You can be sincere, you can be rigorous, you can build something that looks internally consistent and still be wrong. Because you were wrong at step one. One corrupted calculation does not stay contained. It moves through every line that follows. That error will compound, and the further you go, the further you are from the right answer. Now, the Episcopal Church is today's case study. And it kept the bishops. It kept the creeds. It kept the apostolic succession. It kept the sacraments. And then it voted. And then it voted again. Until the votes produced conclusions that the original structure was built to prevent. So Jesus said, I will build my church. He did not say you will vote on it. And that's the argument that I'm going to make in this episode. And I want to trace how we got here. So we have to go back to the year 1783. American Revolution is over, and the British have surrendered. And a Connecticut priest named Samuel Seabury has a serious problem. Samuel Seabury was, by an honest account, the wrong man to build the American church. He had been a loyalist during the Revolution. He served as a chaplain to the British troops that were stationed in New York. He wrote pamphlets under a pen name defending the crown and attacking the push for independence. And at one point, the Patriot forces arrested him. So he was not a founding father. He was, from the perspective of the new republic, an enemy. And yet, when the clergy of Connecticut needed someone to go to England and obtain episcopal consecration for the new American church, they elected Samuel Seabury. Now, he accepted it. He paid his own passage, and he sailed to London on July 7th, 1783. And what he found when he got to London was a wall, because the Church of England required that any bishop had to swear an oath of allegiance to the British crown. And Samuel Seabury was a citizen of the United States of America, so he could not swear that. So the English bishops turned him away. Samuel Seabury traveled 3,000 miles, and he got nothing. But he didn't go home. He went 500 miles north by stagecoach, over roads that he described later as barely fit for cattle. He went into Scotland. Now, the Scottish Episcopal Church was not the established Church of Scotland. It was a minority church. It was legally tolerated, but historically persecuted, with no connection at all to the British government, which meant it had no oath requirement, which also meant it could consecrate an American. So on November the 14th, 1784, in Bishop John Skinner's private chapel on Longacre Street in Aberdeen, Samuel Seabury knelt before three Scottish bishops. Bishop Robert Kilgore, he was the Primus of Scotland and the Bishop of Aberdeen. Bishop Arthur Petrie, he was the Bishop of Ross and Moray. And Bishop John Skinner, he was the coadjutor bishop of Aberdeen. So they three lay their hands on him, and the apostolic succession, stretching back through an unbroken chain of bishops to the apostles themselves, passed to an American for the first time. So it didn't happen in Westminster Abbey. It didn't happen in the Canterbury Cathedral. It happened in a private home in a city that Samuel Seabury had reached by stagecoach, in a church that the British government had spent decades trying to suppress. The first bishop of the American church was a former loyalist, consecrated in secret by a persecuted minority church in a bishop's living quarters. God does have a sense of humor. So Samuel Seabury returned to America in 1785 as the Bishop of Connecticut, and he carried with him the apostolic succession intact. And he also carried a promise that he had made to the Scottish bishops. They had consecrated him on one condition, that he promote the Scottish form of the Eucharistic prayer back in America, and he kept that promise. The influence of that Scottish prayer is still visible in the Episcopal Church's liturgy today. In 1789, the same year that the United States Constitution was ratified, the Protestant Episcopal Church held its first General Convention, and they revised the Book of Common Prayer. They removed all references to the English monarch. They kept the bishops, they kept the creeds, they kept the sacraments, they kept the apostolic succession, and they built a church that looked almost identical to the Church of England, with one critical difference. There was no supreme authority. The king had been the anchor the whole time, but without him, who held that chain? So before we go further, you have to go back again. If you'll remember the Anglican episode, you already know what the Via Media is. If you don't, I recommend you go back and listen to the Anglican Church episode. But Queen Elizabeth I needed a church that could hold both Catholics and Protestants under one roof, and she accomplished that through ambiguity. The Articles of Religion were written broadly enough that a Calvinist could affirm them and a near-Catholic could affirm them. The liturgy was written to feel like the Mass without being the Mass, because nothing was pressed to a conclusion. At least that was the design. And it's important to understand that the Via Media is not theology. It's just a political strategy that's dressed up in theological language. And what it says is that we don't need to resolve the question. We just need to hold together people who disagree about the question. But in a republic, you have a different problem because there is no monarch. There's a general convention, there's two houses, there's a democratic process, and there's the majority vote. And the Via Media in a democracy means whoever controls the vote controls the doctrine. Not truth, not tradition, the vote. And so the American founders of the Episcopal Church did not see that coming. They were building a church for educated, rational, civic-minded Christians. Men who had read books by John Locke and Richard Hooker. Men who believed in order and reason and measured religion. The chaos that they feared was enthusiasm, the kind that are produced by the Methodist and the Baptist. They decided the Episcopal Church would be different. It would be the church for the people who had outgrown the shouting. And for the next century and a half, that is exactly what it was. The Episcopal Church became the church of the American establishment. And the numbers on this are not subtle. 11 of the first 16 presidents were Episcopalian or they were Anglican. They include George Washington, James Madison, James Monroe, John Tyler, William Henry Harrison, Franklin Pierce, Chester Arthur, Theodore Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Gerald Ford. And then the list of the Supreme Court justices, the senators, the cabinet secretaries with Episcopal connections, it reads like a social register. We're talking old money, New England families, Virginia plantation owners, the educated professional class. If you wanted to belong in certain rooms in the 19th century America, you were Episcopal. And so this gave the church an extraordinary cultural influence. But it also gave the church a problem that it wouldn't recognize for generations. When your church is the church of the powerful, you stop shaping the culture, and the culture starts shaping you. The Via Media, which is designed to hold tension, became a tool for avoiding tension entirely. You don't have to take a hard position when your job is to keep the right people comfortable. You don't have to say difficult things when your congregants are writing the checks. So the church of the establishment over time becomes the chaplain of the establishment, and chaplains do not rebuke kings. So to be clear, there was genuine faith in the Episcopal Church. There were serious theologians, there were faithful priests, there were devoted congregations. The Book of Common Prayer shaped English-speaking Christianity in ways that still echo today. The daily office, the morning and evening prayer, the collects. This is not a dismissal. It's an honest account of what structure produces when it's no longer anchored by conviction. So now, let us apply the framework. Who is God? Now, officially, the Episcopal Church answers this correctly because the Nicene Creed is in every Sunday liturgy, the Trinity is affirmed, the Incarnation is affirmed, the resurrection is affirmed. So on paper, the Episcopal Church, fully orthodox. Who is man? This is where it starts to soften. Because remember, the Anglican tradition inherited a complex anthropology. Thomas Cranmer and the early English reformers held a strong doctrine of original sin. The 39 Articles, which remain the doctrinal standard of the Episcopal Church, are very blunt. Article 9 says, original sin is the fault and the corruption of the nature of every man naturally engendered. Article 10 says that the condition of man after the fall is such that he cannot turn and prepare himself by his own natural strength and good works to faith and calling upon God. That is not mild language. But English religion, unlike continental Calvinism, has always had a softening instinct. The Via Media softened it further, but the American Episcopal tradition softened it even further. By the 20th century, the dominant Episcopal anthropology and practice was closer to optimistic liberalism than to Augustine. Man is good, man is capable, man needs guidance, not rescue. The liturgy still said one thing, but then the pulpit often said another. So what went wrong? If man is basically good, then the answer shifts. It's not sin in the classical sense. It's just ignorance. It's injustice. It's structures. It's system. The problem is external. It's not internal. So then the fix, therefore, has to be external, like education, social reform, inclusion, progress, which then begs the next question. How is it fixed? The traditional Episcopal answer was sacramental. Baptism, Eucharist, confession, ordination. The means of grace administered by a church in apostolic succession. The progressive Episcopal answer, which became dominant in the late 20th century, is therapeutic and political. You are fixed by being affirmed. You are fixed by a church that looks like you, sounds like you, and tells you that you are already whole. So the structure of the sacraments remained, but the substance they were meant to convey was replaced. So now the 1960s broke the American establishment. The Civil Rights Movement, the Vietnam War, the Sexual Revolution, the collapse of traditional authority. Every institution in American life was under pressure to redefine itself. And the Episcopal Church felt it acutely because it was the establishment church. So you cannot be the church of power and then claim to be prophetic when the powerful are under attack. The Episcopal Church made a choice, largely unconsciously, to align with the cultural left. Not as a conspiracy, as a surrender. Because the Via Media had no resources to resist. You cannot say we hold both positions when one side insists that the other position is immoral. And on July 29, 1974, at the Church of the Advocate in North Philadelphia, 11 women gathered for an ordination service. The Church of the Advocate was a predominantly black congregation at 18th and Diamond Street. It was the only church in America that agreed to host what was about to happen. More than 2,000 people filled the building. The Black Panthers provided security because there had been threats of violence. And the 11 women entered through the back door as a precaution. 3 retired bishops laid hands on them. Bishop Daniel Corrigan, Bishop Robert DeWitt, and Bishop Edward Wells II. The women were Merrill Bittner, Alain Bosart Campbell, Allison Cheek, Emily Hewitt, Carter Hayward, Susan Hyatt, Marie Moorfield, Jeanette Picard, Betty Scheiss, Katrina Swanson, and Nancy Wittig. They became known as the Philadelphia 11. These were the first women ordained as priests in the Episcopal Church, 2 years before the General Convention had authorized it. Now, the oldest of these 11 was Jeanette Picard. She was 79 years old. She said she had felt called to the priesthood since she was 11, so she'd waited 68 years. On August the 15th, 1974, the House of Bishops convened a special session. They voted 129-9 with 8 abstentions to declare the Philadelphia ordinations invalid. Now, the women remained, in the eyes of the institution, deacons, not priests. The votes had been cast and the hands had been laid, but the institution said no. Now, 2 years later, the institution changed its mind. In a general convention of September 1976, the Episcopal Church officially authorized the ordination of women to the priesthood and the episcopate. The Philadelphia ordinations were retroactively recognized. And the question that matters here is not whether women are capable or worthy or called. The question is, who has the authority to make that decision? The church had maintained male-only priesthood for 2,000 years, and the General Convention voted to change it. Not a council of bishops bound by tradition, not an authority reaching back to the apostles, a vote. And so 27 years later, the vote happened again. And in August 2003, the General Convention met in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Before them was the consent to confirm the election of the Reverend Canon Victor Gene Robinson as the 9th Bishop of New Hampshire. Victor Gene Robinson was openly gay, and he lived with his male partner. His election as a bishop had appeared on June 7, 2003, at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Concord, New Hampshire. Now, the House deputies voted first. Victor Gene Robinson needed 56 votes in both the lay and the clerical orders. And in the lay orders, he received 63 votes, and in the clerical order, he received 65 votes. So roughly a 2-to-1 margin. The next day, the House of Bishops voted, and by a similar proportion, they consented. So on November the 2nd, 2003, Victor Gene Robinson was consecrated as Bishop of New Hampshire in Durham. And he was the first openly gay bishop in the history of the Anglican Communion. Now, the response from the global Anglican world was immediate. Bishops across Africa, who represent the largest Anglican population on earth, broke communion with the Episcopal Church. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Rowan Williams, attempted to hold the communion together, but he couldn't. The Via Media, when pressed to a genuine breaking point, broke. The strategy that was designed to hold everything together held nothing together. Traditional Episcopalians did not simply accept the outcome. There were parishes that left, dioceses that left. And in June of 2009, the Anglican Church in North America was formed. With conservative bishops and priests and congregations who could not remain in the Episcopal Church, they realigned with the Anglican provinces in Africa and elsewhere. They kept the liturgy and they kept the creeds, they kept the apostolic succession, but they left the institution. Now, the Episcopal Church sued many of them for the church buildings, and it won most of the cases. The congregations that had built and paid for those buildings over generations lost them to an institution that had left them on matters of conscience. The lawsuits went on for years, and some of them are still in litigation today. The membership numbers tell the final part of the story. In 1960, the Episcopal Church claimed approximately 3.4 million members. And by 2023, that number had fallen to roughly 1.6 million. That is not a statistical fluctuation. That is collapse. In the same period, the American population nearly doubled. The Episcopal Church didn't just fail to grow, it shrank while the country grew around it. Now, you've heard me talk about my own history in earlier episodes. I've spent years as an atheist who believed I had no position, and I told myself that I was simply following the evidence. I had no faith commitments. I have no theological agenda. I was just a neutral observer of religion. But I was not neutral. Because neutrality about ultimate questions is not a position that you hold. It's a position that holds you. When you refuse to commit to the truth, you don't stay in place. You drift. And drift has a direction. It goes toward whatever the surrounding culture is moving toward, because without an anchor, current is the only force acting on you. Now, Queen Elizabeth I, she understood this about politics. She did not understand it about theology. The Via Media is the church's version of my atheism. It said, we don't need to resolve the question. We need to hold together people who disagree about the question. And for a time, that does work. It works as long as no one presses the question. But questions get pressed. The world does not agree to stay ambiguous forever. And when that pressure came in the 1960s and the 70s, the Episcopal Church had no answer because it had spent 4 centuries training itself not to give answers. It had built a big, beautiful house with no foundation. The liturgy was magnificent, and the music was extraordinary. and the architecture is serious. But when the flood came, the house moved. Now, here's what I want you to hold as you leave this episode. The Episcopal Church kept more Catholic structure than any other Protestant denomination in America. It kept bishops in apostolic succession. It kept the creeds. It kept the sacraments. It kept the liturgical calendar. It kept the structured daily prayer office. It kept the vestments. Incense is used in some of the parishes, prayers for the dead. Structurally, a traditional Episcopal liturgy looks remarkably close to a Catholic Mass. And yet, the Episcopal Church in 2025 is among the most theologically progressive major denominations in America. That's not a coincidence. It is a result. When you keep the form and you abandon the substance, the form does not protect you. It becomes the thing you hide behind while you change everything else. So the altar is still there. The priest is still there. The words are still there. But the altar now means something different. The priesthood now means something different. And the words now carry a different weight. The architecture of orthodoxy without the doctrine that built it is a museum. It is beautiful. It is quiet. And it is emptying. So let's close the framework. Who is God? In the liturgy, the God of Nicaea, fully orthodox. In much of the actual preaching and teaching of the contemporary Episcopal Church, a God who affirms, includes, and never confronts. Those are not the same God. Who is man? In the 39 articles, a fallen creature in desperate need of grace. But in the actual practice of much of the contemporary Episcopal Church, a basically dignified being who needs affirmation in community. Those are not the same anthropology. So what went wrong? In the tradition, it's sin. Personal, structural, inherited, real sin. In practice, exclusion, judgment, and failure to affirm. Those are not the same problem. So how is it fixed? In the tradition, the sacraments of a church in apostolic succession, faith, repentance, and grace. But in practice, a community that welcomes you exactly as you are and never asks you to be anything different. Again, not the same answer. The liturgy is intact, but the theology underneath it has in many places been replaced. That is the Episcopal story. The Via Media didn't hold the tension. It resolved the tension by abandoning one side of it. And not all at once, not in a single vote, over generations, quietly, while their building stayed beautiful. So for a moment, let's go back to algebra. The premise was wrong. Not the architecture, not the liturgy, not the people, the premise. When you remove the authority that holds the structure together and you replace it with a vote, you have not reformed the church. You have handed it over to whoever wins the election. And in a culture moving in one direction, the election has a predictable outcome. Jesus said, I will build my church. And the General Convention said, we will vote on it. So the results of that substitution are now visible to anyone willing to look at it. So in the next episode, we are going to leave the established churches entirely. This time, no bishops, no creeds, no apostolic succession, no history to appeal to, no structure to argue about. Just a pastor, a Bible, and a building or a room that can be rented somewhere or used to be an old car dealership or an old gymnasium. We're going to be talking about the non-denominational church. It is the Reformation principle carried to its final form. Every principle that Martin Luther put in motion in 1517 arrives 500 years later at a church with no name, no confession, and a stage. And we'll talk about that next week. As always, this is Veritate, and I'm your host, Johnny Mac. In nomine Patri, Filii, et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. Sancte Michael, Arcangele, defende nos in proelio. contra nequitiam and insidious diaboli esto praesidium. Imperilli Deus supplices deprecamur tuque. Principalite celesti Satanam maliosques spiritus malignos, qui ad perditione marimarum pervagantur in mundo. Divina virtute in infernum detrude. Amen. In nomine Patri et Filii et Spiritui Sancti. Amen. May God bless you.
Thank you for listening to Veritate. If you would like to contact the show, please email us at veritate@yahoo.com. That's veritate@yahoo.com. Thanks again, and we look forward to hearing from you. May God bless you all.